Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 347. It's been a while. I want to thank you all for your patience over the last few weeks, as this will be our first new episode in nearly a month. There's just been a lot going on. Some travel, some general work busyness, and of course, family commitments. But it just so happens that I'm recording this on September 22nd, which, as you probably know, is Bilbo and Frodo's birthday and Hobbit Day. And that wasn't even intentional, just a happy coincidence. So it's perhaps a little wink from Tolkien himself. At least I'm going to think of it that way. Also, Greta says hi and can't wait to join us again soon. I do feel like we are both wrapping up a lot of things that has made this year a little slower on the content front. But I've been developing a plan for the podcast that will get Greta involved again more regularly, and I'm excited to share more about that very soon. All right. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the Fall of Númenor by exploring the chapter circa 1590, The Three Rings Are Completed in Eregion. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick those hands up, fellowship. You've been warned. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsht. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, and KG. And a shout out to Alaskan Moose 31, who was already a patron but boosted their pledge. Thank you so much, Alaskan Moose 31. Really appreciate it and hope Alaska is beautiful this time of year. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in September of 2023. Ann E., Garrett P., Mario G., Matt R., Ben D., Lauren H., William H., Henry B., Jonathan L., Austin B., Carol W. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. And by the way, you will be getting a shout out on the next couple of episodes whenever they happen, assuming they will in October, because you kind of got gypped on your shout out episodes for your month. So we will make that up to you. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lends you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. And if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners. Subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right. So, the original source for this chapter is primarily Lord of the Rings, Book 1, Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past, and Unfinished Tales. So, who was the ruler of Númenor at this time? Let's review real quick, even though I believe we covered that on our last episode. The ruler of Númenor during this period of time was Tar Telperion. She was the second ruling queen of Númenor, and during her reign, many momentous events would unfold in Middle-earth. So, she had kind of an important reign, important figure, even though we don't have a lot written about her, just in terms of, what happened during her reign, some turning points for Númenor, but also, as we're going to see over the course of the next couple of chapters, some very momentous things occurring, very action-packed things occurring in this several hundred-year period during which she reigned as Queen of Númenor. All right. So, the chapter opens with an excerpt from The Lord of the Rings, and we get this little snippet from Gandalf as he's speaking to Frodo. In Eregion long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. So, I read this, and one of the things that sticks out to me is this whole notion of the earlier rings being prototypes for, the greater rings that would come later, and especially for the rings of power. And I think that this just gets back to that whole idea of the rings being a form of what Tolkien back then might have, or Tolkien would have referred to within the context of the Legendarium and of fantasy writing as magic, but it's also, what we might call in the modern world technology, right? It's these, these tools that we create for making the will more efficient, right? More able to carry out things on a larger scale, on a quicker scale. That is the idea that Tolkien was reaching for with the rings, that he was aiming for, when it came to the magic that is contained within these rings. For Tolkien, magic wasn't, the ideal fantasy thing. This is maybe where we could say Tolkien differs from somebody like J.K. Rowling. The goal of the technology or magic was not necessarily this mystical thing, at least not in a good way. But technology was something. Magic was something that was capable of doing things that machines in the modern age are able to do, right? It's not actually something that, this is something you give life to, but it's a machine that you create to carry out your will more effectively and more efficiently. So it's interesting in that context to think about the earlier rings being prototypes of these rings. And you might say, like, well, why were these Elven smiths so interested in making them, right? Like, weren't they more interested in making things of beauty? Well, again, like, my favorite example is, of course, the smartphone technology, which is, has essentially taken over our lives, over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. And, you think about it, and one of the things they try to highlight with those when they're selling them is that they're beautiful in their own way, right? They're these beautiful, sleek, futuristic-looking devices, right? Design is so important a part of them. So there is an aesthetic factor to those, to magic, to technology as well. But these earlier rings are indeed prototypes of the later rings, and I've covered in other videos how Sauron uncovers and unfolds this, or he unfolds this ring scheme, right, involving the rings that he instructs the elves to make, and he kind of teaches them the magic or the technology that goes into the creation of these rings. And as far as how the rings are perilous, well, these later rings are perilous because of the great power that they contain, the great power they concentrate and give to the person who has them. Again, like, we can think of just all kinds of different technologies as being perilous, right? I think of the nuclear power as being a very perilous technology, right? That we have unpacked over the course of the last century, and the early, they were early on in the creation of, like, the atomic bomb. They were starting with smaller experiments in criticality, and these weren't experiments that were capable of causing the massive explosions that they later had, or even of creating, the kind of scale of nuclear power plants that they needed to create in order to power, large cities. But the prototypes led to, once you kind of have the prototypes in place and you kind of prove the concept, you can expand that out to much greater things and to much greater schemes. So, we might make the argument that all of this is, neutral in a way. All of this technology, all of this magic, these rings are neutral in their own way. But it's the wielder that ultimately, can cause them to become dangerous and perilous and evil. So anyway, of course, the question, the philosophy of the rings of power is one of the central questions in Tolkien's Legendarium. I won't go on too much more about it right now, but there's a lot contained in Gandalf's words there to Frodo. All right, so the 3 rings are completed in Eregion, and we then turn to a section that deals with the Nandoran realm of Lorinand. The Nandoran realm of Lorinand is the realm that is going to become known later on as Lothlorien. It is this region on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, and it's within what's called the Vale of Anduin, right? So Anduin is the river that runs north to south, kind of splits the main portion of Middle-earth that we think of in the Second and Third Age down the middle. And on either side of that, in kind of the central region of the map that we're used to, is going to be this Vale of Anduin. And so these people, the Nandoran elves, were elves that began. So if you'll go back to the beginning of the story of the elves, before the First Age, you'll remember that the Valar summoned the elves to come to the Blessed Realm. And before that, the elves have been living in a land in the Far East called the Cuiviénen, right? So this was the land of awakening. So some of the elves decide to go all the way, to make the journey all the way to the west, and then they cross over the Great Sea, and they arrive in the Blessed Realm. These are the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. And then some of them remain in Beleriand, so they make the journey most of the way, but then they never make it all the way over the sea, and these are the Sindarin elves. And then there are various groups of elves who don't make it all the way, or some who never even leave at all, right? Who never even leave the region of Cuiviénen at all. So some of the elves that don't make it all the way even to Beleriand are these Nandoran elves, and they make their home in this region they call Lorinand, and it is in the Vale of Anduin. The Nandoran had no princes or rulers and lived their lives free of care before the coming of Mordor's power in the Second Age. Sauron's success with the Noldor of Eregion really comes about because they desire, and especially Celebrimbor, the leader of kind of this guild of elven smiths, desires to rival the skill and fame of Feanor. It's how Sauron is able to have influence with them versus the people of Gil-galad and Lindan, or the Nandoran peoples of Lorinand. The Nandoran peoples were not used to having someone rule. They were pretty simple people. You might almost think of them as like, in a way like the Hobbit version of elves, right? Or maybe I have that backwards, the elf version of hobbits. Anyway, you get my point, right? They're a simpler version of the elves. They're content to kind of be at peace in the land where they live. They don't have need of rulers or of or any of these sorts of things. They kind of live this carefree life there in that region. Of course, what the problem for them is that they reside in a place that is a lot closer than a lot of these other regions to Mordor. So we look at our map here, and you look where it says Rohan on this map. Of course, my cursor doesn't work. I got to figure that out at some point. But you look at where it says Rohan on this map, and it's really a little further north from just kind of due north from the A and Rohan, and is going to be the region of Lothlorien. And this is the region where the Nandoran elves live. So you'll notice that they're very close to Dol Guldur, right, which is going to come into play at a later time. And then of all of these regions that we're talking about, you have Eregion over here and Eriador in the south part of Eriador, and then you have Lindan, which is way to the west over here. So of these three regions, look who's closest to Mordor. Well, it's the Nandoran elves in the region of Lorinand. So they may not want any trouble, but trouble is coming to them. And I think Galadriel, what we learn is that maybe Galadriel senses this. And so that's why she chooses, once she's exiled from Eregion, from Lindan, she chooses to make the journey through Khazad-dûm to this region on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. So one thing we also learn is that, again, going back to the elves of Eregion, they were able to be seduced by Sauron, and Sauron was really able to influence them because of their desire to create these beautiful things. And when it comes to the chief of these elves, Celebrimbor, he desired to rival the skill and fame of Feanor. So I just pause at that when I read, he wanted to rival Feanor of all elves, right? That just seems why would you want to do that, right? Why would you want to rival somebody like Feanor? Well, of course, okay, he wants to rival Feanor in the sense of being a being as great an elf, a smith as he was, right? A creator of these various artifacts. So, we might say to ourselves, well, that's good, actually. Like, some people who are, who have certain skills and invest themselves in doing certain things should want to be, right? They should want to be really good at it. They should want to be able to, to improve themselves and to, challenge the best in history, right? I just think of like, talking about a particular sport or something like that, right? Think about the Olympics. Well, we have these world records of like the best time ever in this, and those are there and they're meant to be broken, right? That's kind of a famous saying is, we have these world records and records are meant to be broken. So I don't fault Celebrimbor necessarily for wanting to rival Feanor in terms of his skill as a craftsman. What's really interesting is that Celebrimbor is actually a grandson of Feanor. So Feanor was actually his grandfather. So Celebrimbor's father was Curufin, who was one of the 7 sons of Feanor. So it can be argued that this kind of skill to be a great craftsman is in the DNA of Celebrimbor. So I think the thing that I find fault with on the part of Celebrimbor here is the desire for fame, right? It says he desired to rival the skill and fame of Feanor. Well, why was Feanor famous? Well, he was famous because he created beautiful things, and obviously he created the Silmarils. But and that in and of itself may make us pause, right? Oh, well, he like the greatest skill and he was most famous because he created the Silmarils, but he was also famous because he had a flaming hot temper and he did some really stupid things and led the Noldor in rebellion against the Valar. So, it's one of these things where I'm sure Celebrimbor wasn't thinking to himself like, oh, I want to be famous for rebelling against the Valar and, maybe leading some of my people and murdering some of our brethren. But, that's where maybe, this desire can ultimately lead. And when one has this desire, to do these great things, it might seem like a good desire in and of itself, but the question you always have to ask yourself is at what cost? What cost does one have to pay in order to arrive at that? We can go back and I encourage you to go back and listen again to our episodes of Feanor because the story of Feanor really contains all these elements within it. He creates these Silmarils and they rival or they capture something of the beauty of the 2 trees, the light from the 2 trees, and maybe that's part of the problem. But so Celebrimbor is he's creating these 3 rings. He's leading the elves in creating these 3 rings, and it's perhaps that's kind of what he's aiming for is these 3 artifacts that are going to rival the greatness of the Silmarils. So anyway, there's a lot packed into just that simple statement about Celebrimbor. And we also learned that Sauron posed as an emissary of the Valar sent to Middle-earth to aid the elves. In this way, we might think of him as the Anti-Gandalf. In the same way that it is said that the Antichrist would portray himself as a sort of messianic figure. The evil figures of history don't usually present themselves to the ones they're trying to seduce as the evil figures of history, right? Usually they have to work the people, work their audience, in order to develop them to the point to where they can manipulate them even further into possibly doing things that are even evil acts. So, so Sauron comes as one who wants to aid the elves. And remember, so it's not necessarily, because Gandalf and the other wizards eventually come to Middle-earth with the goal of aiding the peoples of Middle-earth against Sauron and his forces. But in the case of Sauron, he's coming and saying, I'm going to help you, elves, preserve the beauty of Middle-earth. I'm going to help you make Middle-earth into a place that rivals the Blessed Realm, right? So he comes, almost in this spirit of like, I'm going to help you do these, like kind of create this paradise in Middle-earth. That's the temptation he brings with him. It's probably one of those things where we want to be careful whenever anybody comes to us promising us paradise in this world. At least that's the way I read it, and I think that Tolkien in general would have agreed with that theme. Somebody comes to you promising paradise in this world in your lifetime, or even in the next the next generation. You're building for it, the next generation. I don't know. I just don't know that that's even truly possible. The thing you might want is you might want peace, right? You might want a relative amount of peace, but can you have perfect peace in this world? I don't think so. So Sauron comes, and I think that's what we can read between the lines here. Is he's promising? And I have reason to think that based on other things that have been written, we've read about in these stories. But Sauron comes is pretending to be this emissary of the Valar and promising to bring paradise, help the elves bring about paradise within Middle Earth as opposed to within the Blessed Realm. Now Galadriel will have none of Sauron. Galadriel is not buying it. She just doesn't. She doesn't believe Sauron is in any way a good figure, and it's not clear to me actually whether she understands who Sauron is just yet. But nevertheless, whoever this figure is, she's not buying it. She has reason to doubt his intentions. It says, he perceived at once that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and obstacle, and he endeavored therefore to placate her, bearing her scorn with outward patience and courtesy. So initially he tries to kind of sweet talk, placate. He has outward patience and courtesy towards her. But she's not buying it. Galadriel's too smart. And it says, so great became his hold on the Gwaith y Myrdain, who are these smiths, the guild of smiths in Eregion, that at length he persuaded them to revolt against Galadriel and Celeborn and to seize power in Eregion. And that was at some time between 1350 and 1400 of the Second Age. Galadriel thereupon left Eregion and passed through Khazad-dûm to Lorenand, taking with her Amroth and Celebrion. But Celeborn would not enter the mansions of the dwarves, and he remained behind in Eregion, disregarded by Celebrimbor. In Lorenand, Galadriel took up rule and defense against Sauron. So she makes the journey through Khazad-dûm and eventually comes to Lorenand, where maybe she makes the proposal. It's like, look, I know you guys don't like having a ruler, but you're going to need one. Which maybe, sometimes, it's necessary for, ruling powers to have a little more power. The ruling figures to have a little more power during times of great trial, great difficulty. It doesn't exactly say she's ruling here with an iron fist, and I have to think that Galadriel had a little more ability than to just have to go iron fist method on the people of this region. But nevertheless, she comes to this region and sets up camp with the Nondoran elves to kind of maybe present a first line of defense against Sauron and against the forces of Mordor. Why wouldn't Celeborn make that journey through Khazad-dûm? That's an interesting little note there. Well, Celeborn was in the First Age. Celeborn dwelt in Doriath, which was the region that was sacked by a number of dwarves towards the end of the First Age. So Celeborn harbored kind of a deep resentment, you would say, towards the dwarves as a people, because of what he saw there. Now, were any of these dwarves who lived in Khazad-dûm involved in that? I don't think so, but nevertheless, that's where Celeborn's animus towards dwarves in general comes from. All right, and one final note on the region of Lorenand. Where does this name come from? Well, it's the Nondoran word for Valley of Golden Light. Valley of Golden Light. So this is the region, of course, that will become Lothlorien in later time, as the years go by and Galadriel continues to dwell there. And of course, Celeborn will eventually come to dwell there as well, but not for some time. He has to find his way there eventually. All right, so let's take a quick peek at the artwork in this chapter. So the chapter begins with pencil sketch of what appears to be one of the rings of power, possibly right after it has been forged. Kind of looks like the One Ring, to be honest. The other 3 rings, I believe, had stones that were set within them, and I don't see any kind of stone holder there with any of those rings. So perhaps we're seeing a picture of the One Ring being forged there. So maybe coming a little bit early in the chapters here, but still, nevertheless, a neat pencil sketch. And then the other image is titled "Galadriel Leads the Elves Through Moria." Really, really cool image of Galadriel and the dwarves and Khazad-dûm in what we might say is its original majesty. We're most used to thinking of it in terms of being this wasteland under the mountains, this wasted kingdom that's now kind of overrun by orcs at different times, and where no dwarves live, and there's not really a whole lot of light. But in this time, we see it was actually originally a pretty beautiful beautiful place under the mountains here. All right, well, that about does it for this chapter. So what are the key takeaways? Well, for me, I think the biggest lesson is that fame is a poor goal. One may achieve fame in the course of other achievements, but we probably know stories of fame achieved becoming more of a curse than a blessing. And I think that's definitely the case with Celebrimbor here. The other big takeaway is that Galadriel was indeed one of Sauron's chief opponents in the Second Age. In fact, she chose to move toward what might be termed the front lines even after she was exiled from Eregion. So once again, Galadriel, really proving to be one of Tolkien's strongest characters, and indeed one, I like to point this out at different times because every once in a while somebody will come along and say, "Oh, Tolkien had weak female characters," but the truth is that he had, of the female characters he had in his stories, they tended to be pretty strong figures, and Galadriel certainly is one of the strongest of all of the elves. Maybe his greatest elf character of all of them. All right, next time we'll learn about Sauron's forging of the One Ring in Mount Doom, the completion of Barad-dûr, and the late dawning of Sauron's true intentions upon Celebrimbor. As always, keep the correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. I know it's been a while. We're probably a little backed up on our correspondence at this point, but we will get back to that, doing that on a more regular basis at some point. And then don't forget to stop by TrueMythsPress.com for great merch like super styling and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, 2 Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's TrueMythsPress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. All right. Thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Melkor27, KG, Emilio P, Jonathan D, Robert H., Paul D, Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Richard K, Matt R, Matthew W, John W, Eugene D, Chris B, Daniel S, Seb M, Cory C, Carolyn S, Emiel K, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T, Redhawk, Shannon S, Brian O, Zeke F, James L, Chris L, Asya V, Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C, David of Pints with Jack, Eric B, and Alaskan Moose 31. All right. Thank you all so much for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.